Welcome everyone to another episode of Power Core Productions and Podcastings. I'm your host, John Harrington, back to hit you another video, and today we're going to be continuing the highly acclaimed rebooted series here on Power Core Productions and Podcastings, and that is What If Spider-Man Was in ReZero, The Princess and the Spider, Season 1, Part 2. First and foremost, I do want to say thank you to all of the support that I got for the pilot video that came out yesterday. I know that video was pretty long, almost 2 hours in length. Honestly, probably could have been a little longer if I didn't shave some stuff off here and there. And while we're here, I do want to ask if you guys really do like the multi-hour videos. Simply because it's not a matter of if I can or can't make them, it's just a matter of getting them out in a timely manner. Like that video took almost 2 hours to upload onto YouTube after the editing process was finished. So the longer it is, it's really just a matter of taking the extra time for it to get up. That's usually why I try to keep my videos between 30 to 40 minutes, maybe an hour, no longer than an hour and 30. You know, that's just how I try to keep things steady and moving at a reasonable time, because otherwise, who knows when you guys will get a video. You might get it at 2 or 3 in the morning, depending on how much time it takes to edit and put in the work and all that stuff. And we covered a lot in the first video. A lot of the story was basically covered in the part 1. So from here, the next 2 parts to wrap up season 1 won't really be as long, including the OVA that will be a part of this season as well. So we're basically going to continue this season, and we'll be concluding on Friday with the OVA endgame. So that's something to look forward to as well. But I do hope you will continue to enjoy Power Core Productions and Podcastings. It truly means a lot to me. As I always say, you guys make the channel grow, you make the core grow. Cannot do it without you guys, and I am extremely thankful as we are on the road to 1K and beyond. But anyway, we're not going to stay here for too long. Let's get into the video. So as always, sit back, relax, and enjoy the show of What If Spider-Man Was in ReZero, The Princess and the Spider, Season 1, Part 2. Enjoy. Following Peter's fight with the Maw Beast, he would take some time to recover back in the mansion. As Roswald would soon return, he would be pleased to learn of Peter's exploits in helping to clear the forest of all of the rogue Maw Beasts. He was especially proud to see that he had chosen a good warrior to be in his stead, someone capable of holding their own. Peter's recovery wasn't nearly as long as you might have thought it was. As with his radioactive blood, it allowed his body to regenerate and recover a lot better than a regular human. And while his gait was exhausted, it was brought back to 85% complete health, meaning that it wouldn't take too long for him to be at full strength, although he would be warned to be careful with his magic and to not overdo it. In the meantime, the women of the household would look after Peter, Rem being especially close to him of all of the other girls. Ron would look over him carefully, although it didn't really go any farther than that, and Amelia all the same, along with Beatrice, who would visit his room from time to time and give him a book to read while sitting beside with him and making small talk. Of course, she would always carry the attitude of acting as if she didn't want to be there, but even though she wouldn't admit it now, Peter had truly grown on her. All in all, he was a nice boy and a gentleman, so to speak. He never barged into her room without asking, unlike a certain someone. Peter would hear this mentioned, and he would ask about who this certain someone was. The women of the household having to explain that around a year ago, some strange-looking boy in a tracksuit had arrived. He had helped Amelia one day in town and basically decided to stay there. He had undergone training and through a long and hard process, eventually ended up becoming a rather respectable knight and fighter, although he eventually would have to leave and be called off as a situation had occurred over to a country in the west, Lagunica sending some of its forces, and he unfortunately were sent along. The last thing they could remember was him being dragged out of the mansion kicking and screaming, as the only thing he wanted to do was spend time with Miss Amelia. However, Amelia would tell him that if he did a good job and made it back home, then she would be waiting for him with a big hug, which was all the young warrior needed as he made his way. Peter would try to ask more about who this person was. However, the only thing that he would ever learn would be when Ron would call him Barasu, or something along those lines, a way of insulting him, and he never got to learn of his true name. Unknown to Peter, he wasn't the only one who had gotten isekai'd into this world. But that story is a story for another day. In the meantime, while Peter had finished recovering, he had to get to work on rebuilding one of his other web shooters, as the first one had been completely destroyed in his fight against the Maw Beast. Although this wouldn't be too difficult, and soon his web shooters would be good as new, along with rebrandishing his sword, making it more elegant and a lot more refined for his fighting skills. As Peter would work on his sword, not too long after, a dragon carriage would arrive to the mansion area. Out of it would step a rather cute-looking young girl, Peter believed, with cat-like ears. Or so he thought, along with an older gentleman who were commissioning the carriage. As they made their way inside, Peter, Amelia, and the others would greet them, as they introduced themselves as Felix and Wilhelm, as they had come to speak with Amelia about a pressing matter regarding the royal selection in the capital. While they would speak to Amelia, Peter would simply go about fine-tuning his swords and making sure that everything were in order, as there wasn't really much else for him to do. Of course, he would do some studying. After all, he had been trying to learn the country's language and all, and he had taken up to reading some of the books in Beatrice's library. Among many of the stories that he read some about the fantastical Maw Beasts, and among them the 3 great Maw Beasts. However, one that truly caught his attention was that of a white whale. Peter wondering if he would ever come across something like that in his travels. As the conversation were wrapping up, Amelia would inform Peter that she were going to be called to the capital for the beginning of the royal selection, and he wondered if he would need to go as well. Roswald would be all too thrilled for Peter to come along. In fact, it would be mandatory, as he was her guard after all, and he would simply list her as being her official knight. Peter would be a bit taken aback to see that he would be given a title like knight, not sure if he could truly earn or live up to a title like that. However, Roswald would be all too eager for Peter to attend, and he would assure him that after seeing and hearing of what he could do, then Peter was more than qualified to come along. With that, Peter and Rem would pack their bags, as they would leave with Amelia and Roswald. Peter would be dressed in his Spider-Man uniform, as he had been accustomed to wearing it. However, to make him look more regal in a way, Rem had made a special cloak for Peter to wear over his uniform. It was all blue with a hood, and on its back was a red spider sewn onto it, to give him something of a regal aesthetic. After all, he was the Amazing Spider-Man. With his sword on his back, he was prepared and ready to go, as the 4 would arrive to the capital of Lagunica, where Peter had first shown up in his adventures. While making their way, Peter would see some old familiar faces, among them being the Opera Man, and he would even buy a few as a way of saying thanks for all of his help. Not too long, they would soon arrive to where they were supposed to be, as outside of the particular area, another man would arrive. He would show up as well as greeting both Amelia and saying hello to Peter, not sure of who he was. Amelia would introduce him as Julius, and Julius would ask who Peter was. Peter would introduce himself, as he would state that he were Amelia's guard for this trip, and Julius would wonder if he were a knight of another country, wondering why he was dressed in a strange blue and red attire. Peter would explain that his official name was Spider-Man, and Julius would ask if he could summon a horde of spiders. This was starting to become a bit of an annoying trope for Peter, as it seemed as though everyone assumed that that was a power that he had. Of all the powers that he did gain from being Spider-Man, that was certainly not one of them. In the meantime, Emilia would go inside with Julius, as she needed to use the media to contact Felix to help heal Peter in his gait, as it could still use some improvement. In the meantime, Peter would wait outside, looking up at the sky as he didn't really have much else to do. As he did so, he could hear something coming from an alleyway not too far behind him. Being the hero that he was never one to turn away from someone yelling in need, and he would quickly make his way over to the alley to see what the problem was. Of course, the last thing he expected to see were the same old thugs from before. However, there was a girl there as well, dressed in red and black with auburn-colored hair. The same muggers would look at Peter and realize that it was him, the web guy, and that they didn't want to get involved with him. And they would quickly run away, cowering with their tails between their legs. As Peter went to check on the young girl and ask if she were alright, she would arrogantly say that she were in control of the situation and that she didn't need help from Peter. Peter wondering how anyone could be so snobby, he would simply try to brush the comments aside. But she would elaborate, saying that she were a rather lucky girl, and in this world everything she wanted always catered to her whims, as she introduced herself as Priscilla. All the same though, Peter was just happy to make sure that no one was hurt, as her guard would arrive, along with Emilia, who would ask how Peter knew who Priscilla was. Although Peter would explain that he didn't really know her at all, and that he had simply heard her being attacked by some muggers, and he scared them away. Priscilla's guard would walk up to Peter and thank him, giving him a large pat on the back for his assistance. While Peter would go back with Emilia, Priscilla would ask what it was that Peter was carrying in his bag. Showing them off as some appas, she would comment that they were usually white, although Peter would assure her that this was indeed an appa, as he would toss her one before heading off with Emilia, as they made their way back to the inn where they would be staying. Not too long after, Felix would arrive, and here a lot more revelations would be revealed for Peter, especially learning that Felix was indeed a boy and not a girl. Learning that looks can always be deceiving. But none the same, Felix would get to work on Peter, as he was adept at water and in healing magic, and as such, he would get Peter's gait fully restored and ready to go, so he would be prepared for when the royal selection would begin. The group would make their way inside, as Peter would align himself with the other knights respectively, Emilia waving to him while Peter would wish her good luck, as she and Roswald took their places among the council, waiting as the other participants would arrive. Peter would meet with Priscilla's guard, who would be happy to see him again, along with Felix, who would have shown up with his candidate as well, along with Julius respectively. The final candidate to show up was one that would be a shocker to Peter and Emilia. As they looked at the door, the final girl to make her entrance would be none other than Felt of all people. Peter wondering how she of anyone could have been a candidate. And not too far behind her would be none other than the red-haired master swordsman, Reinhardt. Reinhardt would be happy to see that Peter were doing fine, and he liked the robe. He would tell Peter that he had actually been looking for Felt for some time, and that it was just by chance that the two would cross each other that very day. So in a way, he was very thankful for Peter and his help, although Peter wasn't really sure if he had done all that much. With that, the knights would take their places as the candidates would step forward, each one stating their own claim as to why they should be the ruler. Among them, Felt would make it very clear that she had no intentions on ruling, and that if it were up to her, if she were given the throne, she would burn the entire establishment to the ground. Peter snickering a little bit as he realized anarchism really did exist no matter what the world. Finally, Amelia would take her place, as she stepped forward confidently to the council. She would tell of wanting to create a fair and just world where everyone could be equal and happy, a world without discrimination and prejudice. For Peter, he lived in a world where discrimination also existed, this showing that it too could carry on no matter where you went. And it made him feel as though rooting for Amelia were all the more important. Among all of the other candidates, there always seemed to be an underlying motive, some form of greed. One just wanted to dominate with military might. One just wanted to explore her own riches. One was snobby and arrogant and just wanted everyone to bow down to her. And while Felt was a good girl, she did kind of wake up choosing violence. However, Amelia was different from them. Amelia truly wanted to change things for the better, despite all that she had been through. However, her words would fall on deaf ears, as the council would instead mock her, disgracing her for even having the audacity to try to be a candidate, especially when she had the look of the witch. Amelia would be hurt by these words, but Peter would be more annoyed than anything else. "Hey, you assholes!" "What? How dare you?" "No, how dare you? I mean, do you guys just have webs up your ass? Or what the hell is going on here?" Peter, please, you don't have to." "No, I do. You have all of these arrogant and stuck-up assholes, and yet the one person who shows the capabilities of being a good leader, but you talk down to her? What's up with these four?" "No offense, Felt, but look at her. All she wants to do is explore military power. She's nothing more but a big power drunk. She's nothing but a greedy bitch. She's just stuck up and arrogant and thinks everything works for her. And again, no offense, Felt, but you just want to burn the establishment. Amelia actually wants to try and work hard to improve Lagunica, to improve things for everyone. But what do? You pick on her because she looks like someone that you're afraid of? I don't know who this Witch of Envy is. Honestly, I don't care because I've seen far worse than a stupid witch. But as far as I'm concerned, if you can't see how good Amelia is to be a ruler, then you truly are blind and foolish. Peter would then have a nervous sweat on his face, as he realized that he had just spoken out of turn to the entire council, the council being shocked at his very audacity. Even Julius would stand up annoyed at Peter's outburst, as he told him to sit down, as he probably wasn't even a knight and he had no business being here in the first place. Peter was starting to get rather annoyed with this and the whole situation. However, another distraction would soon burst into the room, as Old Man Ron would appear, running over to try to grab Felt and get her away. However, he wouldn't get too far, as all of the knights would have him pinned to the ground with their swords drawn, Reinhardt moving Felt out of the way as Julius was the first to have him pinned. Peter was now even more annoyed to see that they were hassling Old Man Ron, and he quickly jumped on top of the ceiling, shooting down his webbings and pinning down a few of the knights before picking up Old Man Ron once again. As Julius tried to step forward and take a swipe at Peter, Peter's spider sense proved to be his undoing, as he grabbed and flipped him over. "You arrogant little bastard." Sucks to be you, doesn't it? Just what right do you have to be here? Spider-Man? What kind of a stupid name is that? You're no knight. You have no nobility. What heroics have you performed in your life? What right do you think you have to stand here among the elite? What right? You really want to know? Probably haven't done too much, Your Highness. But from where I'm from, I've held my own against some of the best. And trust me, I've fought in people a lot more stronger and scarier than you. You might be able to go around here and punk a couple of swordsmen, but I've swapped hands with a god, Everyone would be surprised at Peter's words, Peter being shocked himself at his own brazenness. To say that Thanos was a god was kind of a bit of a stretch, although maybe not, as when one has the Infinity Gauntlet, you are indeed a god. And the fact of the matter was that Peter had fought others a lot more stronger than Julius could ever imagine, or hope to be. With that, Julius would then point over to the window, where the arena was not too far from here. He would tell Peter if he were so confident, why don't he back up those words and meet him in the ring? And Peter was all too eager to accept the challenge, as the two made their way out of the royal selection along with all the other knights, Emilia being immensely worried as she wasn't sure what was going to happen. The crowd in the arena were going wild. Reinhardt and Felt looked at each other nervously, along with Felix, who too were also a little worried for Peter and his safety. However, Wilhelm had been observing Peter this whole time. He could tell that there was something more to this boy than met the eye, and that he was just going to have to wait and see what he could do. As the two stood in the middle of the arena, both being given wooden swords, Peter would get himself ready, as he got into a spider-like stance, while Julius stood at the ready. Well, I have no problem squashing a bug like you. So whenever you're ready, let's begin. Well, you asked for it. As Julius could not see under Peter's cloak, Peter had been charging a wind cannon, and at the right moment, he launched it straight towards Julius. Julius being blown back by the gust of wind, unable to think that Peter would have been capable of using such magic, as Peter shot himself into the air and began to rain down webbed balls. Julius would use his sword to try to cut through them. However, a few of them would stick, causing his sword to get stuck to the ground. Before Julius even had a chance to think, Peter would deliver an upper kick to his chin, sending him flying straight into the air. I guess all that time watching WWE really paid off. Thanks, Shawn Michaels. Peter would then jump into the air after delivering a sweet chin music to Julius. As Julius wasn't too far behind, he would attempt to call upon his fire spirits to launch an attack and build some distance between he and Peter. Peter would nearly be singed by some of the flames, however he would be able to dodge them all the same, almost as if his spider sense was keeping him in the fight. Even when Julius tried to deliver a couple of shots from the behind, it proved to be useless as Peter seemed to be able to dodge them effortlessly. What Peter did not know was that by learning to use magic and those sort of mystic arts, it increased his spider sense much greatly, allowing him even greater sense to what was around him. Julius would then pick up his sword once again, as Peter would do with his, the two of them colliding as they engaged in a flurry. It was very obvious that Julius had the upper hand in terms of swordplay. That was undeniable, even for Peter. While he was good enough to use one, he was no sword master, and Julius had been training in sword combat his whole life. No amount of spider power was going to help Peter there. However, what Peter lacked in swordplay, he more than made up for in ingenuity and in overall skill, proving to have just enough tricks to keep Julius on his toes, before ultimately Julius found himself being planted on his back, with Peter holding his sword to Julius's neck, telling him to yield. The crowd would begin to roar as if the roof was going to come off the arena. Even Emilia would be shocked at just how well Peter was able to fight. If anything that he said was truly true, then he was something to be feared. Wilhelm shook his head in agreement, along with Reinhardt. The two of them both realizing that Peter, he could be very deadly. Sure, he didn't have the sword play down now, but with some proper sword training, along with adding them with his other skills, and that sixth sin of his, he could be one of the most dangerous knights in all of Lagunica. Of course, Reinhardt still thought in his heart of hearts if it ever came down to it, he could beat Peter in a fight, as he felt as though while Peter was skilled, he didn't have the power. Of course, he didn't have the power yet. All the same though, Peter would be cheered by everyone as Amelia would make her way down through the arena. While she would be a bit angered at him for getting into a fight with Julius, she was still impressed nonetheless that he was able to win. Even the other candidates were shocked at Peter's power, and a bit afraid to think that someone like him would be in the service of a girl like her. If she ever truly did have an ulterior motive, outside of Reinhardt and maybe Wilhelm, there's no telling who else in this country could stand a chance to him if it really came down to it. All the same though, Peter would look down at Julius before helping him up. Even if he were happy that he had gotten a win, he didn't want to be a complete asshole. Although he would make it very clear that he should apologize to Amelia. And all the same, Julius would do so. He would apologize to Peter as well, making peace and telling him that he were foolish to doubt his strength. He was indeed worthy of a title of knight, and he was sorry for his arrogance. Peter would apologize for his outburst as well, and that he probably could have handled things a bit better, but from time to time his anger would get the best of him. The two would shake hands in a nod of respect, as the crowd would continue to cheer, happy to see a fine fight between two great warriors, as they would all return for the end of the royal selection. With the royal selection now over, it seemed as though everyone were going to be preparing to go back home. However, as they were getting their things together and getting in order to prepare for leaving, Peter would be approached by Wilhelm and Julius. The two of them had been talking, and they wanted to see what Peter was truly capable of. They would ask if Peter wouldn't mind staying in the capital for a little longer for a little bit of training, to see if he had the skills to truly stand alongside many of the other knights. Peter would wonder if he actually could. This would be a nice experience for him, and he wondered if Julius would even mind teaching him some of those spirit arts, if possible. Roswald would be all too eager for Peter to stay back, telling him that this could make him far more stronger and far more beneficial to the overall protection of Amelia and the others. Thinking about it more and more, it didn't make a lot of sense, although he asked if he could afford to stay back for that long. Although, Roswald would assure him that it would only be for a small time, and that nothing too bad could happen, right? With that, Amelia and Roswald would stay the night before leaving in the morning. Amelia would wave to Peter and Rem, as Rem would stay behind to help out Peter with anything he might need, telling them that she looked forward to seeing them rather soon when they returned. While Peter would stay back in the capital, as he would get training in both swordplay and in the spirit arts. During Peter's training, which would take about 1 week, he would focus on two aspects. In the morning, he would do sword training with Wilhelm, and in the afternoon, he would do spirit arts training with Julius. For this portion, in terms of Peter's sword fighting style, I've decided to adopt the fighting style used in Star Wars. Not that the worlds will be connected or anything, but I want to give you a visual synopsis for how Peter will fight with the sword. Looking through the sword styles, I've decided that the fighting sword style that Peter would be best for would be the Form Style 4 from Star Wars. This lightsaber combat is known as Ataru. If you need a frame of reference, look at how Master Yoda fights and imagine Peter doing the moves that Master Yoda could do. Peter, being a rather smaller but nimble sort of fighter, allows him to do more acrobatic, speedy, and aggressive fighting styles. Coupled with his spider sense making him aware of all of his surroundings, I believe that this form of fighting style would be one that Peter would adopt. As Wilhelm is a master of swordplay, I believe that he would have such a form in one of his arsenals. He could look for it through an archive and show it to Peter, instructing him in the steps and the forms that needed to be taken. It's not that this is going to be in the exact form of Ataru, but it will be Ataru light, so you'll get the image of how Peter fights as a swordsman. And when it came to Julius and his spirit arts, Peter would learn to communicate with the spirits. After all, he had the wind affinity, so communicating with the wind spirits wouldn't be too difficult. After a few days, he would begin to make contact more and more, slowly learning to discern what they were seeing through a form of emotion, the link that was formed between him and the wind spirits. As they would seemingly gravitate towards him and his kind-hearted nature, being much like himself, a free-flowing spirit in the wind. This would prove to be useful as he would now have the ability to incorporate wind spirit arts into his arsenal, allowing him to not have to use up all of his mana via his gate. And with the wind spirits, he could summon small vortexes and even tornadoes to an extent. After a week's worth of training, Peter would overall have the basics and everything that he would need. Wilhelm would give him a book on the swordplay that he had been learning, so that he could study and improve on his own. And Julius would commend him for his efforts, telling him that he had truly grown as a fighter. With that, Peter would bow to the two of them, thanking them for all of their help. As soon after, Peter and Rem would say their goodbyes as they made their way back to the mansion. For Rem, she had been extremely happy as she had now had one-on-one time with Peter while he were training. It wasn't anything much, although whenever he wasn't training, the two of them would walk around the capital at night, looking up at the stars and looking up at how lit up the city was. They would go to a couple of food stands and try some of the delicacies, as well as look over the lakeside. For Rem, it were truly a magical moment, to say the least. As they would continue their ride, stopping at an inn before moving over to the area near where the great tree was, known as Fugel's Tree. The ride would prove to be rather uneventful, as Peter and Rem would make conversation. However, their conversation would be cut short, as a thick fog would begin to surround them, making it almost impossible to see, even with their lamp. Rem would look extremely worried, as she told Peter that they needed to get out of there as soon as possible. Peter would ask what was going on, but Rem would explain that the fog was usually the signaling for the white whale. This would fill Peter with absolute terror, as he had no idea that he would ever actually run into the damn thing. They could hear a whale-like noise coming from either side of them, but they weren't sure where it could be. Peter would summon a gust of wind and blow out as much of the fog as he could. However, as he did so, the eye of the whale would be right beside the carriage. Rem would use evasive maneuvers to try to get them as far away from the whale as possible, but that proved to be more difficult. Rem was preparing to enter into her demon Oni form to buy some time and fend off the whale. However, Peter would tell her not to do so, grabbing her and telling her to stay and focus on the carriage, and that he would take care of the whale, although that would still prove to be a daunting task. Peter would then summon as much of his wind spirit arts that he could, channeling it all through his sword, as he prepared a slicing vortex, powered up by wind spirit arts, believing that it should be enough to counter the whale. With one mighty slash, he would shoot it from behind the carriage in a great slicing gust of wind, cutting the whale in the eye, believing that he had done just enough to get them out of there. However, this attack proved to be nothing but a mere inconvenience, as the whale would continue on in its attack, soon knocking over the carriage, as Rem would disappear into the dark fog. Peter would try to call out to her, but there was no answer. As he turned back around, the last thing he would hear would be the loud noise of the whale. as another layer of fog would blow all over him. As he swung his sword attempting to fight, he would feel a dark haze falling upon him, and not too long after, his very presence would be erased. Peter would fall into a high anxiety because this feeling was all too familiar. The feeling of being erased from the very existence of reality. An experience he was all too familiar with. Peter would awaken at the lakeside, just where he would have spent his time meditating and focusing on his wind spirit's training. He realized that he was back in his body, back at the time where his training had wrapped up, and it was supposed to be the next day when they were to leave and go back to the mansion. However, knowing what he knew now, he knew that they needed to make their way to the mansion as quickly as possible, especially with something like the white whale out there. Of course, Peter did want to try to alert the others to what was going on, but he knew that it would be hard to do so. He still had to deal with whatever this return by death was, whatever this strange ability. He knew that trying to speak of it was rather difficult. He had tried on a few occasions to try other ways to communicate. The last one was one that ended in absolute failure. Unknown to everyone else, Peter had in fact tried to communicate return by death, writing down his words in a letter. However, with every pen stroke, his heart grew more and more in pain. The moment he tried to hand the letter to Amelia, his sky began to change. The whole atmosphere turned dark as a sinister but soothing voice came into his ear. Peter. We don't want you making this too easy, now do we? I'll let you go this time with a warning. At that moment, Peter would reawaken, back to where he had started. It meant that not only could he not speak of return by death, but he couldn't so much as try to communicate it through a letter. Any trying to mention of the power resulted in an instant death, or at least that's what he believed, and the last thing he needed was wasting his time running around in an infinite circle. From there, Peter would alert Rem to the situation at hand, telling them that they needed to leave as soon as possible. However, he would point out to avoid the path near Fugel's tree. If it came down to it, he would go back there and investigate the white whale on his own when the time came. While Rem couldn't completely understand what Peter was talking about, she did know enough of him to trust in his words, and the two would set out on their dragon carriage. However, they would make sure to take the shortcut to avoid Fugel's tree. While passing by, they would see some traveling merchants, but they wouldn't stop to speak too much longer, although one of them tried to sell them some jars of oil. In the meantime, they would stop that night at an inn where they would rest before leaving in the morning. Peter couldn't help but shake the feeling as if there was something looming over them. It made him feel all the more anxious to want to get back to the mansion as soon as possible. As he sat in his room, finding it hard to sleep, Rem would come in with her nightgown as well. Peter coming to attention and blushing a little bit how cute she was, although he would try to remain focused on the task at hand. Rem would sit with Peter as she said that she had this weird feeling also, telling him of the sort of telepathy that she shared with her sister, and that she could sense when she were in pain, or might about to go through pain. The two of them would both express their various concerns, but they would assure one another that no matter what, as long as they stuck together, they could get through anything. With that, Rem would fall asleep in Peter's arms, and he would just fall asleep next to her. As they awaited until the next day, the two would wake up early in the morning and continue their ride, soon entering into the Mather's domain. As they continued and made their way into the territory, a dark and cold presence began to be felt around them. It was growing more and more. Peter and Rem could both sense it. Something malevolent was walking amongst them. Not too long as they were making their way on the path, a group of men in cloaks would surround the entire carriage. Peter, looking around to wonder if they were being ambushed, he could feel Rem and her hands trembling on the saddle. He would look to Rem and he would see a cold expression in her eyes. Rem, what's going on? Cultists. What? Rem! Cultists! The witch cult! Peter's eyes would widen at the realization of what were happening. The ones who had hurt Rem and Ram. The ones who had caused them so much pain. It was them, and they were in the Mather's domain. If this group were here, then the village, no, the mansion, there was no telling what they could be up to. Peter would then get a sense from his spider sense, alerting him to some immediate danger coming from the carriage. He would grab Rem and swing into the forest, moving just out of the way in the nick of time as the carriage would explode, along with the dragon rider being killed in the process. The two would quickly get on their feet as they would be surrounded by the army of witch cultists once again. Rem entering into her demon Oni form, while Peter would start channeling wind spirits along with his sword, the two standing back to back. Peter would tell Rem to move on ahead and that he would take care of the witch cultists, but Rem did not plan on leaving him behind. With no choice, the two of them would get to work as they began fighting against the cultists. Their magic proved to be formidable, but Peter, with his magic-resistant webbing, was able to put them in a bind, along with his skills with the sword. He wasn't too fond of killing. Anyone could notice that. Even slaying the mobbies took a lot out of him. Rem had asked Peter why killing was so hard, and Peter would explain that in the world that he had come from, he wasn't a killer. It just wasn't his thing. It wasn't what he did. However, knowing more of Peter's backstory, Rem would point out, though, that when he fought the one known as Thanos, what was his team planning to do with him? That was when Peter had to stop, and he had to accept a cold realization about himself. It was something that Mr. Stark had talked to him about for a long time. Of course, Iron Man wasn't fond of killing either. No hero truly was, at least not most of them. Although there were reports on the news about one vigilante that had been going around and declaring his own war against crime. Some guy with a skull on his shirt. Used a lot of guns too. He had talked to Iron Man about this on occasion, asking if it was right for a hero to kill. Tony told him that it was a complicated answer. Sometimes there is no right and wrong way. Even looking at someone like Captain America who fought in World War II, he fought with a shield but still knew how to use a gun. Sometimes, even if you don't want to, it comes down to you and the enemy. And your enemy isn't going to give a second thought to taking your life. And even if you could spare them, it might only do more harm in the long run. With a heavy heart, Peter took to cutting down his enemies. However, he tried to do so in the most humane way, never wanting to take pleasure in the killing, since that wasn't his style. He figured if he were killing for any reason, it would simply be for an act of mercy. Mercy to his enemies and to his own soul. As the two had finished fighting off the witch cultists, some would retreat, although they would be speaking in weird tongue and rhyme, although there would repeatedly be a mention to the name Betelgeuse. Peter and Rem wondering what the name Betelgeuse was, if that could be their leader potentially. They had no idea. The two would then continue on foot to the village, hoping that it hadn't been attacked. However, they would soon find something that no one would want to see. As they made their way to the village, they would see it left in complete and utter ruin. Nothing but bodies. Bodies laying out all across the grounds. Bodies of the witch cultists. Bodies of the civilians who tried to fight. The men who tried to fight off the witch cultists but were slain. The women cuddling the dead bodies of their children as they too were slaughtered by the cult. Rem could not stop shaking. Peter was absolutely horrified and sick. The way they had been killed, it was nothing but pure and utter evil. Even for someone like Thanos, Peter couldn't imagine that the Mad Titan would do anything this vile. It was absolutely horrid. What sick and twisted soul could do such a thing? Peter threw up multiple times. It was so much to take in. He thought as though he wanted to take his own life. There was no way anyone could be capable of such violence. As he saw the bodies of the children, contorted, twisted, maimed, and ripped to shreds, it just made him burst into his own tears. He was supposed to be a hero, to look after them, to care for them. They looked to him. How could he have let this happen? Rem couldn't stop shaking, but she knew they had to keep going. They had to get to the mansion as soon as possible. With a heavy heart, Peter would pick himself up, and the two would rush forward to Roswell's mansion, hoping that the situation would be different. But hope was all that they could ask for. As they came across a sad and twisted reality. As they arrived to the mansion, they could see that it had been attacked. The bodies of the witch cultists strewn all across the grounds. Peter and Rem walking and making their way through. As they looked over, Rem would see a body all too familiar. Peter would simply shake his head. He didn't want to believe that it could have happened. But as they made their way closer, there was no denying with the pink hair and the maid's outfit. They saw what was left of Ram, along with Petra, whose own head had been taken off her shoulders. Rem would fall to her knees. As she yelled a large and howling scream. The sound of a wounded heart, of a soul that had been broken 1,000 times. It reminded Peter of when he had been killed by Ram in the previous loop, remembering her howls in pain at the loss of her sister. Beatrice was right. When they were separated from one another, it was like losing a part of their soul that they could never get back. Rem's screams and howls would alert the witch cultists that would surround them. Peter's eyes had now begun to change, as the wind spirits began to be channeled all around him. His once bright and hopeful blue slowly began to flicker into a dark and crimson red. From everything that he had been through, from his days as a hero in New York, to fighting against the Mad Titan, to the world that he found himself in now, he had never come across something so vile, so repulsive. Even if he believed in peace, there would be none today. As he unsheathed his sword, the wind spirits now forming around him, and Rem, her demon-Oni form beginning to flare. The two would power up to their max as they began to slaughter the witch cultists all around them. There would be no mercy, no forgiveness. Now there was only righteous judgment at the hand of his blade and at the swing of her mace. Rem would look to Peter as she told him he needed to go and save Amelia and the others. Peter looked back with his own ferocity as he told her he did not intend to leave her here to die. Before he could argue, Rem would walk up to him, yanking him by the collar and lifting up his mask. She lifted it just enough as she gave him a simple kiss. It was nothing long, but still, in its short and brief moment, it was a kiss of unbridled passion, a kiss of sorrow, of pain, of regret, and filled with nothing but unbridled, unrelenting love. She told Peter that she would catch up soon after, but that he needed to go. Hearing the sternness in her voice, he would understand what she meant as he rushed forward into the mansion. Rem would give it everything she had, facing off against the ever-growing number of the cultists, while she put up a valiant fight and slaughtered many of them. Ultimately, they would prove to just be too much to overcome, and she would fall at the hands of their own sword. As Peter made his way into the mansion, any of the straggling cultists, they were slaughtered at his blade. As he found himself going deeper and deeper into the catacombs of the mansion, it grew colder as he soon found himself in front of a frozen door with a few more cultists who had been caught in the ice. With a deep breath, Peter would open the door to find a room full of ice. In the middle of the floor, curled in a ball, was Amelia. Peter would walk to her side, trying to see if she were awake. "You're too late, Peter." Puck? She was a kind soul. I gave her this frozen slumber so that I could always protect her, that she may pass on to the next life in peace. But now that she is gone, I have no reason to hold back any longer. In a great explosion, the mansion would be completely devastated. Peter would be launched into the air as he fell upon a pile of debris and snow, the sky beginning to grow darker as the land began to be frozen in ice. As Peter looked among the wreckage, he would see a body laying in the ground. As he walked towards it, he would see that it were none other than Rem. With a heavy heart, he would fall to his knees as he picked up the young girl's body, holding her cold and lifeless corpse in his arms. His tears would freeze automatically, as even with his radioactive blood, his limbs soon became nothing more but stone. As he looked up one last time, he would see a ferocious beast, the beast of the end, as he became nothing more but a memory in the frozen darkness. Peter would awaken back to the lakeside once more. The first thing he could do was rush to his feet as he ran to find Rem, who was caring about making sure of the small things. He would rush to her and give her a hug. The young girl did not know why Peter was doing what he did, but she didn't complain, as a hug from Peter was something she more than desired. Peter would only hold her for a while, just not wanting to let her go. However, soon he would have even more pressing matters. With everything that he knew now, the situation at hand was a lot more bleaker than he wanted to imagine. From the information he had gathered, the witch cultists would attack the village and the mansion in 3 days' time from now. But there was also the threat of the white whale that would appear less than a day after. This gave him roughly 4 to 5 days to find a solution, and time was not on his side. Peter would then make a quick meeting with Wilhelm, as he would ask about the history of the white whale, where he would learn quite a bit, learning of the great maw beast and how it had been tormenting humanity for over 400 years, as well as the death of his wife, who lost her life at the hands of the beast, and Wilhelm personally vowed that if he ever got the chance, he would slaughter it with his own blade. Now knowing all of the information, Peter knew that it was going to be a gamble. He needed help to take out the white whale, but at the same time, he might need help with the cultists. Although from what he could have learned from the last fight, they were drawn to him like moths to the flame, most likely because of the scent of the witch. Peter knew that, even at his best, taking out the witch cultists might be easier said than done, although he had gotten stronger. He would then ponder everything he had learned, before ultimately, he would decide that a meeting needed to be held. He would meet with one of the candidates, the one known as Crucia, as he would explain the situation as best he could. He would say simply that he had gotten rumor by word of mouth that the white whale might be sighted at Fugel's tree in less than 5 days. This would capture their attention, although they would be a bit perturbed as to how Peter could have such information. Peter would explain that for him to explain how he had gotten such information, it would be more trouble than it could have ever been worth. But he would confirm where and when the white whale would be, and if they were willing, they needed to amass an army and be strong enough to defeat the whale when the time came. However, Crucia would not be so quick to take the bait, telling Peter that she cannot afford to expend her forces to try to help another domain, and if she were to do so, she would want massive compensation, that in the form of Emilia's removal from the candidacy, taking out one of her competitors. Peter would be a bit annoyed, as the fact that innocent people were going to die just did not seem to be her concern. It was enough to make him tell her off. However, he would still have to calm himself, remembering a conversation that he had had with Tony. It had been some time before the events of Infinity War, while he was an intern at Stark Industries. Tony was on the phone while eating a cheeseburger, getting through with some business, and Peter had asked him about how he conducted himself the way that he did. Tony explained that when it came to Business 101, you couldn't just be the one with nothing to offer and then demanding everything on the table. That was just showing that you had a weak hand. If Peter truly wanted something, he had to be willing to dangle a few carrots of his own. You couldn't just show up to the picnic empty-handed. And Peter was in fact showing up to a picnic with nothing to offer at this moment. He was asking for all of these things from political rivals, and they weren't going to get anything in return. And whether he wanted to admit it or not, the fact of the matter was that Amelia was still responsible for her own territory. If she wasn't strong enough to protect it, she couldn't be seen as a viable leader. As much as Peter hated that fact, it was still true. However, Peter had been studying the lands of Lagunica, and he had remembered that there were some mining fields not too far in the Mather's domain. Of course, they would still be hard to mine out, as even with this world's advancements in magic, the technological advances were still a bit primitive. Although with his mind and ingenuity, he could get the minerals and whatever valuable precious metals that were inside out with little to no casualty, as he had the ingenuity to do so. After pondering everything over, he would offer a simple suggestion. He would ask that in exchange for Crucia's help, he would give over half of the mining rights in the land of the Mather's domain over to her side, as well as giving her full credit for the defeat of the White Whale, sharing in its glory, as taking the White Whale could do much for her status and give her a leg up. And Peter would even try to sweeten the deal. He would tell her that if her army showed and the White Whale did not appear, and all of it proved to be nothing but a lie, then Amelia would drop from the candidacy, and 100% of the mining rights would go to Crucia. This was added to sweeten the deal. Of course, Peter was fully aware that the White Whale would appear when it was supposed to, but Crucia was not. For her, she saw this as a win-win. Get half of the mining rights along with the credit for killing the White Whale. Or, if this proves to be nothing but a wild goose chase, be rid of Amelia and get 100% ownership of the mines. This was something that was almost too good to pass up. Although she would ask, curiously, why Peter would be willing to gamble such a high risk. Peter would simply explain that he cared about the lives of the people in that land. He couldn't understand why the people here acted or behaved the way that they did, although deep down he kind of understood, since he came from a country that operated almost in the same way. But nonetheless, he only had one goal in mind: to save the innocent. That's what mattered to him more than anything else, because before anything he was a hero, and a hero always saves those in need. Crucia would agree to Peter's proposals, and she would ask if there were anything else that Peter would like to have. While he were on the subject, Peter would ask for one thing. He would ask if Wilhelm, along with a few of her best warriors, would come to assist him with a certain matter. The matter being that of the witch cultists who were going to attack. Of course, Peter did not say that the witch cultists were going to be attacking precisely, and Crucia did feel as though she were a bit hesitant to give over Wilhelm to be an assistance in this matter. But Peter said that this could be a way of insurance, as Wilhelm would be with him to make sure that everything would be on the up and up. While Crucia was hesitant, she would ultimately agree, allowing Wilhelm and a small band of her best warriors to escort Peter and Rem back to the Mather's domain. Now having much needed backup, the group would quickly ride out on single dragon riders into the night, without delay. However, as they were riding, Peter would remember the caravan that they had passed before. As he would stop, they would see that the caravan were short on money. Having gotten extra pay from Roswell for his help against the mob beast, he would give them all that he had in exchange for their services. The group, not wanting to turn down a payday, would ask what Peter needed. He would tell them that there were a village and a mansion not too far from here. They needed to ride out into the night and avoid Fugel's tree on the way there. When they arrived to the mansion, as well as to the village, they were to escort everyone somewhere safe. They didn't need to fight or put themselves in harm's way, but Peter needed a way to ensure that the villagers could be getting out safely if worse came to worse. While among them, the young one with the jars of oil named Otto was a bit nervous at all of this. Once he learned that Peter had close connections with the one known as Roswald, he would ask personally to have an audience with him when this was over, and Peter would promise him such an audience. With that, the caravan would make their way along with the dragon riders, as they rode through the night without any sleep or hesitation, arriving with just enough time to spare. From there, Peter would organize everyone to move into different directions. He would tell Wilhelm to escort Rem to the mansion and to help get everyone out of there to safety. He would tell the other band of warriors, along with the merchants, to head to the village and load everyone up in their carts and to get them moving away as quickly as possible. As they did so, the witch cultists had not even arrived to their targets, as it was a full day ahead of their original attack, meaning that the spy that had been placed into the village in order to sabotage any potential uproar had not even left yet, giving them ample time to get the villagers and everyone else to safety. Wilhelm would ask Peter if he were going to be alright and what he planned to do, although Peter was already aware of his plan. He said that he was going to lead the witch cultists in the other direction, knowing that if he could be a distraction just long enough for everyone to escape, then whoever was remaining who wanted to fight could come back and aid him, although he thought that he could be more than strong enough to take them down on his own. Rem would still be worried for her sister, for the safety of the villagers, and for Peter as well. But Peter would look back to her, and he would tell her that everything were going to be fine. Because after all, he was a hero, and this was what heroes do. With a smile of confidence, he would give her a thumbs up, as Rem would look upon him fondly, as she and Wilhelm would make their way to the mansion. In the meantime, Peter would head to a far clearing in the opposite direction, knowing that the witch cultist would smell his scent, the scent of the witch, that would be far stronger than ever before. And that was indeed the case, as within their own cave, a dark figure, with his skin green and his fingers long, would bite on them profusely as he twisted and contorted in different ways. My brain trembles. I feel it. Her love, the love, it's moving. But why? Why do you leave me so? We must follow it. You all, go to the village. Fulfill your duty in the name of love. And the rest of us, we will go and find our beloved. Go in the name of love. The leader would call, as the others would begin to move at once as they made their way to carry their orders. As the caravan had arrived with just enough time to spare, they would come with word from Peter, with the villagers listening to what they had to say. They knew that if Peter were recommending for them to get away to safety, then they would need to do so. While Wilhelm and Rem would make it back to the mansion, they would receive word that Roswald had already left, going to the sanctuary, but that in the meantime they needed to get out of there as soon as possible. With that, they would soon escort and make their way out of the area. However, once everyone was being sent over to a safer location, Rem would turn behind, knowing that she couldn't leave Peter, and soon to follow would be both Ram and Amelia, along with Wilhelm, as well as a few warriors, while the others would get to escorting the villagers, Some would be taken to the sanctuary, while others would be taken back to the capital for safety, and all of them would return back home in due time. As the day had finally come, there was not a breeze in the sky, not so much as a gust of wind. All of it had been drawn to one location. Peter stood waiting. He had spent all the time that he was preparing, drawing on every wind spirit that he could, amassing all of their power. He was going to save everyone, and he was going to bring the witch cultists to an end. As the witch cultists would move onto the village, they would be shocked to see that there would be, in fact, no villagers waiting for them, nor would there be any at the mansion. However, as they went to reconvene, they would be taken out by this group of warriors that had come and accompanied Peter and Rem back to the Mather's domain. While they proved to be rather formidable, they were done away with, as the weaker ones had been sent to the village, unexpected of the fight that they would get into, as they were killed, while the more stronger of the witch cult made their way towards the clearing, where Pride was waiting. As Peter sat in the middle of the clearing, the witch cultists would all surround him. The winds could not be heard. You could hear so much as a leaf falling from the tree into the ground, as among the witch cultists, their leader, the one known as Betelgeuse, would step forward among them. As Peter looked up to the man, his mask now donned and his hood removed, as his eyes began to glow. A great gust of wind would begin to form around him, blowing back all of the witch cultists, save for their leader. I am Betelgeuse. Are you the one? My pride. And that is where we are going to conclude today's video of What If Spider-Man Was in ReZero, The Princess and the Spider, Season 1, Part 2. Stay tuned for Part 3 that will be coming out tomorrow, as well as the OVA Endgame that will be coming out on Friday. For all this and more, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share, and hit that bell for post notifications so you can stay up to date on everything that is Power Core Productions and Podcastings. I'm Javon Harrington, signing off, and I'll see you next time.